Here we go. Okay, we'll take one moment to review this handout, which I sent everybody from last week. One of the goals of this letter is to describe the spheros as handles to help us understand how we operate and how Hashem operates. All along, we always have to have this awareness that it's just an illustration. It's accurate, but it's not completely accurate, or it's not limited to the accuracy of what we have. I call it the wink wink. It's like we're talking about the infinity of Hashem, but you can't really talk about the infinity of Hashem. So the spheros become tools through which we can discuss godliness, discuss how our internal godliness operates, and our character becomes a launching pad for understanding how Hashem operates. But that's ridiculous. How could you compare us to Hashem? You can never do that. Okay, now that you can never do it, now we're going to do it. And I understand the innate contradiction in that. But this is one of the gifts that Hasidus gives us, is that we are able to talk about God, not just about how God impacts us, as long as we recognize that it's not really the full-on essence of Hashem. It's merely an insight. So here is the terms. I don't think it's necessary for me to read them. Hopefully everybody got them in the email. If you want me to put it back up there, I will, but we'll just leave it there. Again, the midos start with Keser, which is the crown, which sits above the midos. And remember, we go right to left, so it's a little clumsy here, but this is the right side midos, and you see how there's some corollary between them. These are all about infinite expanse. I can imagine anything, I can give to anyone, I can stick to it through all challenges. The left side is about restraint, analysis. Now things have to start to work in the engineering perspective, not just in the creative artistic. I have to restrain myself. I have to restrain my sense of glory to give others glory. Let someone else take the lead, let somebody else make the joke, and so on. And then these become combined and blended together like Das, where I take an idea, I run it through the mill until it manifests itself in something particular and specific. Harmony is like the beauty between the limitless and the restraint, because limitless can be a flood and restraint can be harsh. Harmony is about the blending of the two. And again, remember that the spheres, all of them, are amoral, not immoral, amoral. They don't have a morality. They can be utilized for something virtuous or something harmful. And ultimately, Yesod is the connection, the basic connection. Again, it can be manipulative or it can be constructive. And Malchus is when we put all of that into play. So Chesed is the idea of being kind. Malchus is doing kindness. Gevura is the concept of being orderly. Malchus is putting it into order, etc. And we'll see these as well. Another vocabulary word here, the four elements. This is an idea which we are going to discuss. We talk about everything is comprised of these basic four elements. Some are more profoundly one or the other, and they can be reduced to them: earth, wind, fire, water. So let's keep that in mind, because we're going to visit that again in today's learning. Okay, I'm going to take this off the screen. If somebody wants it back up there, of course, just let me know, and I'll be happy to put it back up. I did email it to everybody, so hopefully everybody got it, and you're familiar with it from last week. We are on, it's the Kitas that begins either the 18th of Elul or the 15th of Elul in letter 15. And again, I keep on emphasizing that we go back and forth. And I understand that it's not absolutely logical, but God is infinite. Why would we anticipate that he's going to fit into our nice, perfect little Newtonian slots of pure Western logic that we utilize ourselves, and that we understand, or we intuit how our body and soul interact and interplay, and that becomes a launching pad for how Hashem interplays with the world. But always remember, it's only our perspective of Hashem. It's not the essence of Hashem. When we understand Hashem through understanding ourselves, we're not fully understanding Hashem. Again, we are understanding our capacity to understand Hashem. And it's important that we make that that specific distinction. Okay. As you'll note here, there's a period, and then it says ach tzorach lahakdim. That word ach, which we have encountered many times before, is a real hard break. Of course, in an actual Torah, and even in the later rabbinic writings in the Talmud and so forth, we don't have punctuation the way we think of it in English. Although even in the Talmud, it does occasionally put in these types of breaks, 2 dots, 1 dot, and so on. And of course, in the later writings, it became even more common. There's periods and commas. But in Torah writing, they don't say just simply conform to proper usage of punctuation. They're much more sparse. So when we see a period, it really suggests a hard break. When you just glance at this page, and almost any page, it's pretty rare. In contrast to if you would write an English sentence, you'd have a period and a comma and a question mark and so forth, much more commonly. So that whenever we see those periods, especially when it's followed by this word ach, which is a real hard break, there's however, but like we have to remember that this is suggesting a real departure from the previous part. And that departure here is the offset of making the mistake of over-literalizing the analogy of human behavior, like we said from that pasuk in Job, from my flesh, and understand that it's not a direct corollary. Excuse me. It's not a direct corollary to how Hashem functions. It's simply a model. It's a launching pad. It's a beginning of an insight. So once we have that disclaimer, once we continuously emphasize, and again, as we mentioned many times, at least I've mentioned many times, and you've been too polite to tell me you know this already, that one of the criticisms of Chassidus was you made Hashem too accessible. You made Hashem too immediate. And there was a fear that that would lead to being casual with the infinity of Hashem and somehow potentially a diminishment of reverence. So here we go. However, tzarich lahakdim, we must preface mashashmaiti mimodi olav shalom. What I heard from my teacher, which is a reference to the Maggid of Mizrich, of Dov Ber of Mizrich. Al pasuk v'nochi offer be'efer shamar Avinu olav shalom. Avram Avinu, in his one of his great dramatic moments, when he is negotiating with Hashem in an attempt to spare the people of Sodom and Amorah. Hopefully everybody remembers the story. Hashem tells Avram he's going to destroy them. And Avram understands that this is an invitation for some pushback. And Avram begins this negotiation and so on. And this is one of the great illustrations of Avram's chesed. That Avram shows limitless kindness to attempt to salvage or to spare the people of Sodom and Amorah. And he speaks in a very forward manner with Hashem. He uses the phrase, "Will the judge of all the world not act justly?" Which borders on chutzpah. And yet he does this. And then in that continuous discussion, Avram says, "I am dust and ash." Now we'll talk a little bit more about dust and ash and whether they are harmonic. They sound the same. A for afar, one with an aleph, one with an ayin. There's some halachic parallel there as well, which we'll get into. But what he means specifically is not just, oh, I'm worthless, I'm nothing, I'm a worm, I'm meaningless, and so on, which we do have such a terminology where a person should see themselves as insignificant and so on. But here the Alter Rebbe says that Avram Avinu is giving us an insight into the character, I'll use that word, the spheres of Hashem, the identifiable aspects of Hashem, by using this phrase specifically that I am dust and ash. Now, a reminder that at this moment, Avram Avinu was engaged in one of the most profound illustrations of his prominent character trait, we have a visitor, which is chesed. And Avram becomes the sort of model of what chesed truly means. So we go. Al ha'aretz nishmasa mira begufay mior chesed elyon v'hi midasay midas ava rabba shabahoy shaya oyed es HaKodesh Baruch Hu ava gedele v'elyena kol kach ad shenasim rakava HaKodesh Baruch Hu. Now, what the Alter Rebbe is going to teach us here is that when Avram says that I am dust and ash, what he's referring to is that his level, that is Avram Avinu's level of chesed and ava, which is his primary, so to speak, gift or his primary character trait, which is such a level of love that Avram has such love, which is love in this case doesn't mean I love it like it's my favorite thing to do, like a person says I love cheese or whatever it is, or I love to go swimming, but he means that I have total and complete surrender and devotion to it, that he is described again as the Merkava. A Merkava translates as a chariot. The analogy of a chariot being that the chariot is completely submissive to the driver. It doesn't have its own opinion. It's a complete tool to the infinity of Hashem. Well, in that sense, Avram Avinu was describing that even his level of love for Hashem, which is so intense that it is described as being a Merkava, a completely surrendered tool to the infinity of Hashem, is hu me'ein v'sug mahus midas ava rabba shel Avram Avinu al v'shalom rak shi gedol v'nifli men l'mayla ma'ala in ketz v'tachlis k'noidus b'midas al yena she'ein lehem ketz v'seif v'tachlis mitzad atzman ki orin seifor chumeir melubish v'seich mamish divi gemuchad mashenke v'neshama sa'adam melubeshes b'chayim she'esh l'mideseg ketz tupo. Now, here the Alter Rebbe lays out that Avram Avinu has this level of love for Hashem that we might think is similar to the love that Hashem has, or the concept of love, meaning the Alter Rebbe is laying out for us, as we'll ultimately understand, that when Avram Avinu says that I am like dust and ash, he's not just coming up with some term to describe his humility or his even literal sense or perceived sense of worthlessness and insignificance. The exact analogy of dust and ash is, as we'll see, that dust and ash were once a block of wood. And the block of wood to the ash is the spectrum or the span, or the analogy of the span between the chesed of Avram and the chesed of Hashem. That is, even the loftiest level of chesed that we align with Abraham, he's the nicest guy you ever met, and he's doing this great act of chesed where he's defending the people of Sodom, whom ultimately are really indefensible, that Hashem destroys them. And remember, as we talk about, he doesn't destroy even Mitzrayim like that, where he literally scorches the earth to the point that it can never again be rebuilt. That it's shocking to us to ever imagine that Sodom and Amorah was once a luxurious, beautiful place. This is like unimaginable to us. And Avram is still trying to defend them. And that level of love, which Avram illustrates, is as close to the love of Hashem as ash is to the original log that from whence it came. And this is that point that's made here. Why? Because God is, again, I know this is a contradiction in terms. The basic definition of Hashem is that he is indefinable. God is infinite. And a human being is ultimately going to be finite. Even the chesed of Avram, which is held up as the most profound illustration, it's still going to be finite. How is it finite? First of all, it has to manifest itself in a particular defense. And it doesn't make this point here, but just to take it one step further, in the defense of Sodom and Amorah, we see this most profoundly because remember, Avram tries to make an argument that they should be saved because I'll find you 50, 45, 40 righteous people. Meaning there is some contour to this chesed. That Avram is essentially arguing that there is a valid reason, or it's not the term I'm looking for. There is an argument to be made. So it's not just infinite. In contrast, although it doesn't really talk about it here, when Moshe Rabbeinu defends the Jewish people after the golden calf, he doesn't make an argument, well, they didn't really do it, or it's not so bad. He makes the infinite argument. You just have to forgive them. That's it. There's no there's no argument to be made. There's no There's no argument to be made. It's simply the infinite appeal to chesed. Okay, so here where it says that within the infinity of Hashem, there is no limitation. There's no contour. Not just limitation, there's just it runs out like, okay, I'm exhausted. But there's no description to it. That's why, remember, audio and visual out of sync. I don't know what to tell you. Sorry. Is everybody else seeing this? Is it not coming out clearly? It is clear. Okay. I don't know. It's not clear. I don't know what to tell you.
No, you were out of sync last week also.
Yeah.
I'm out of sync last week. Okay. Well, it's probably something about me. I don't know what to tell you. Recording, you'll be good. Okay. Abel Mikol Malcolm, nevertheless. We might have thought that Avram Avinu is kind of like the infinity of Hashem. Now, this is a common concept that we run into all the time, whereas we make somewhat of a presumption that God is like me, just bigger, taller, stronger, wiser, kinder, and so forth. And this is a general handicap, which is we presume that everything is like me, just different. So when we meet somebody from a foreign country, we think, well, they have an accent. This is the standard, and they have an accent. Or whatever our imagination is, it's a challenge, maybe even impossible, for us to completely imagine something outside of and different than myself, something completely radically different than myself. Because we are naturally, innately, somewhat self-centered. We presume our own existence, and we extrapolate from there that everything is like me, only different. But I am the premise and the platform. And we potentially do this with Hashem. We assume that Hashem is like me, just better or more, and so on. And this is a foundational mistake. Now, the alternative to this, and again, this is where we get into this issue that some people were not so down with what Hasidus came to teach. The alternative is, well, there's nothing you can know about Hashem. Hashem is just infinite. We are finite, so give it up. So don't even try, because there's no way that you could have any insight into the infinity of Hashem. And that every time it uses something that seems like we can have an understanding for it, the hand of Hashem, the eye of Hashem, it's just completely false. It's not even true. It's just for us, because there's no way we could understand it otherwise, and thus give it up. Now, of course, there is a certain degree that is accurate. We can never know Hashem. Look, we can never really even know another person. We just assume everyone's like us, just different. I like chocolate, therefore they like chocolate. Or if they understood what I understood, then they would like what I would like, and so on. And there is this presumption that everybody is basically the same as I am, just a little different. And there's certainly when it comes to Hashem. Now, that, again, at some level, there's a truth to that. We can never really understand the infinity of Hashem. And whatever it is that we understand about Hashem, we should never make the mistake of thinking that that is Hashem Mamash. Okay? So what is the pushback here? That it gives us that insight and that opportunity. Well, that comes with a lot of vulnerability, because once we start thinking that we understand Hashem, we start thinking that we really understand Hashem. And if we really understand Hashem, we run the risk of saying, well, this is what I like, therefore I decided that this is what God would like. I decided that this is what Hashem would like, because this is what I would like. As silly as saying, well, God must like chocolate because I like chocolate, to saying, well, I wouldn't mind if somebody did that, so why would Hashem mind? So this is where we potentially fall into a deficiency in our reverence for heaven, in Yiras Shamayim, because we get a little casual. So therefore, that's why Avram emphasizes that I am but dust and ash. Because by understanding and by emphasizing that he is dust and ash, he's saying the Kamosha Eif for whom Husavat Musa Shala Eitz. Hanisra Shai Morka Midal Yisaitis, Eish Ruach Mayim Mafa. The Gimel Yisaitis, Eish Mayim Ruach, Hopeful V'Hochel V'Kalo Ba'ashan, Hamasava Makavasan, Kanoida, Yisaid Hadalit, Shai Be'etz, Shua Eifar, Shabahir Lamata, Vena Eishal Letasbai, Huanisha Kayam, Hu Ha'efer. Now, when Avram says that I am but dust and ash, again, he's not just calling out a random form or expression of humility, like saying I'm a worm or I'm worthless or whatever. He's teaching us something very particular. We have a general rule of thumb that all matter is comprised of some combination of four fundamental foundational elements. Now, we're not here to study botany and earth science and so on, so we'll just follow through with this idea that everything, every entity, is a compound of Eish, fire, Mayim, water, Ruach, air, Afar, dirt, Afar with an ayin, dirt. And all matter, it has, or each individual matter has a primary, what it's primarily composed of. And what happens when you add fire to something? It draws out the primary element. So when it comes to a block of wood, its primary element is ofar, dirt. And thus the fire comes and it pulls out the fire, the water, and the air. And what's left over is the ash. Now, ash is the product of that initial piece of wood. The distance between the block of wood and ash is pretty tremendous. But the origin of that ash is the block of wood. We experience this, just to give you an example that you're familiar with burning chametz. There's an interesting discussion in the Gemara about what is the best way to destroy chametz. Is it sufficient to crumple it up and throw it into the sea, or should you burn it? The difference being, if you crumple up chametz and throw it into the sea, what you have is crumpled chametz in the sea. Meaning you have not changed its essential chemical makeup. You've just completely made it unusable. There's no way that it can be eaten, which is the ultimate prohibition, is to eat chametz. So you have neutralized it from its primary form, but it's still essentially, again, I'm using the word chemically, I'm not sure that's the proper term, its chemical makeup is still chametz that's in the sea. In contrast, when we burn chametz, we now chemically change it. It's no longer chametz, it's not just toasted chametz. It becomes ash. It's no longer chametz, it's now ash. At some point, it's been completely transformed. So this is what Avraham Avinu emphasizes, that even this greatest act of chesed that we are describing, and Avraham defending the people of Sodom, is as remotely distant from Hashem's chesed as ash is from the original block of wood. And again, it talks about how it's pulled out all of those others, but the fourth of the elements, which is the dust, is not pulled out. Ein ha'esh shaletes by. The fire cannot damage it. You know, it's a kind of rock, paper, scissors, shoot thing. Every one of the elements has its superiority over the other elements, meaning fire can consume fire. It'll boil water out. It'll suck up all the oxygen in the room, but it can't burn up the earth. And then the earth will smother. You know, each thing has got its superiority. Hu ha'nishakayim, that's what remains. But hu ha'efer, and that's what the ash is. The ash is the remains of what had originally been there with every other aspect pulled out. Now, this whole block of wood, with all of its dimensions, its length, its width, its thickness, and so on, that it was visible before it was burnt, its primary foundational element is offer, is the dirt. And again, as we mentioned, that this teaching about the four primary elements, all matter has its primary element and its secondary element. And again, it's not really the direct purpose of this letter to describe the elements as much as it is to describe the contrast of a block of wood to ash and the midah of Hashem's chesed and Avram's chesed. Rak, She'esh, Mayim, Ruach, those three, Klulim by, they're also part of the block of wood. The dirt is the harshest, the heaviest of them all. And unlike water, fire, and air, dirt has length and thickness and width and so on. But fire and water and air and even water, they have much, much less of their presence in the body of this tree. The dimension characteristic, length, breadth, and width of the block of wood is from the afar, from the dirt element, not from the fire, water, air element. What ultimately happens, shavel afar, it all goes back to the dust. So that after you pull out each of the individual parts through the fire, which consumes the fire, the water, and the air element, just as fire would again suck up a smaller fire, it would suck up or evaporate all of the water and suck up all of the oxygen. So what's left when you remove it is the offer afer. Now again, it's not just the fact that they sound similar, one with an I and one with an aleph. We have other halakhic discussions about the potential interchangeability of offer and afer, of dirt and ash. Just to share it with you, not to be overly down that path, but in the laws of the Soita, the woman accused of infidelity and in her capacity to prove her innocence, they have to take some offer, some dust. So the dust is taken from the floor of the Beis Hamikdash. And it will not surprise you that there are multiple opinions as to whether they have to use literal dust, or is it permissible to simply use ash, to bring in ash and use that. So again, the reason why I bring this up is because the words afer and offer, not only do they sound similar, but the ideas of ash and dirt are potentially halachically interchangeable. And again, it's really more outside of this whole discussion. We don't have to get too detailed about it. The primary purpose that the Alter Rebbe is teaching us is the idea of the infinity of Hashem compared to the finity of Avram. So the chesed of Avram is like the chesed of Hashem, except it's not. And again, I know it's a back and forth, and well, which one is it? Up or down, right or left, in or out, black or white? Well, right, it's all of the above, and life does not fit into those neat little perfect packages that we would imagine. So just like if you look at ash, you can't imagine that this was ever a log, which had length and breadth and thickness, before it was burnt. The ash is not similar to the log quantitatively, or qualitatively, even though that's where it came from. But you can't even imagine, it's been so thoroughly reconfigured and reprocessed that it's unimaginable that there was really ever an infinity of godliness, affinity of this block of wood before, and now it's turned into ash. And again, I don't know, and we're not here to study the physics of it, whether you can somehow study the ash and find out exactly what it once was, whether it was cedar wood or redwood and so on. But again, we get the basic idea that the ash is so incomparable to the original piece of wood And this is the Avram Avinu corollary that he's saying that as incomparable as the ash is to the original piece of wood, that is as incomparable as my chesed is to the chesed of Hashem. Similarly, Avram Avinu says regarding his character, Midas HaChesed, which Avram is the model of Chesed, the Ava and love, that lights up within him, and is invested within his body. Even though this is that level of Atzilus, and remember, Atzilus is the world here, the four worlds. It's totally next to Hashem. It's completely aligned with the infinity of Hashem. As the word Atzilus comes from the word Eitzel, meaning next to. It's completely next to Hashem. So even though Avram Avinu's level of Chesed is a level that comes from Atzilus, it's still as distant from the origin as ash is distant from that block of wood that we started out. That radiated within Avram, and he is a Merkava, and so on. So again, this is that constant push and pull that we have, where we are permitted to use the spheros as descriptives of the infinity of Hashem. As we say in the davening, Hashem aligns himself with these seven spheros, and Avram, who is the prime model of the sphera of Chesed, his Chesed is as distant from Hashem's Chesed as ash is from the original block of wood. Afal Pike, nevertheless, once this Chesed, which began at this loftiest of levels and manifests itself to all the way down to invest itself in the physical body, through the chain-like processes of the Olamais. And remember, the Olamais mean not stages, but stages of awareness. And the, quote, lower the world, the more intensely concealed the godliness. The lower the awareness. Higher worlds, higher awareness. Lower worlds, lower awareness of godliness. More about the Olam than about the godliness that sustains it. Ein dimyan be'erech mahus ora avar meir boy al mahus ora ava l'chesed elyon shabatzilus. You can barely imagine, you can barely tell when this chesed comes down into this physical world that this is anything that is originally sourced in that level of chesed elyon, of godly chesed. I mean, to use almost a silly analogy, you look on the ingredients of some highly processed food, and you can't imagine, and maybe you don't even want to know what some of those things are. Good thing you can't pronounce them. If you knew what they were, you wouldn't want them. But how could you imagine that there was, whatever it is, I'm making it up, grape in this product? We get a little more sensitized to it because of the laws of kashrus, where you look at some food and you say, well, what could be unkosher about this? Because the origin ingredient has been so thoroughly processed, you can't even imagine that it's actually in this product. But it's there, it's processed, all the way until it manifests into something else. Ella, rather, ke'erech v'dimin mahus ha'ofar shenaser efer al mahus v'echusa k'shayetz nechvad l'mayra v'toiv l'mayra. Rather, it's as distant an analogy as the ash is to that original tree, which was desirous and beautiful and appealing to be eaten, which we'll come back to that in a moment. More than that, to separate it by 1,000 separations. And again, this is all that never, 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 never. Okay, now let's talk about it. You never, 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 never. Okay, now we'll talk about it. It's like trying to teach a child about fire safety. Never, never, never. Okay, now we can do it. It's that Torah uses, and again, this is a phrase from Mishle, mushal and melitza. We talked about this last week. A mushal is a way to have some authoritative understanding of an idea, and a melitza is a little bit more of an analogy. But I want to come back to this one phrase where the Alter Rebbe throws in here about the contrast of ash to a tree that is desirous and appealing to the eye and good to eat. This is a quote from Chumash about a tree, quote unquote, a very famous tree, the tree of knowledge. So we ask the question, like, why is the Alter Rebbe throwing that in here? You know, he's not just adding a little melitza, a little quote, just to sound poetic. We understand this is true of every tree. The tree in the backyard today, if you chop it down and you burn it into ash, you can see the contrast. So why does the Alter Rebbe specifically make a reference to the tree of knowledge? It seems out of context. We're just talking about the span, the spectrum, the spread between a tree and ash. Why does he have to throw in a reference to the tree of knowledge of good and evil from the story of Gan Eden? So Kabbalistically, we have an idea that eitz, tree, is related to the concept of zah. Now, how is it related to zah? Remember that zah is zeir anpin. Zeir anpin is the short face. Again, I go back to the handout where we talk about zun is the combination of the short face, zeir anpin, which are the 6 internal midos, not counting malchus, which is putting it into play. Remember, a person can be a kind person, even if they're not doing kindness at the moment. These midos are the internal midos. Okay, only the top line is the intellect, but here we're talking about the character. So Zah and Eitz are Kabbalistically related. How? So again, this requires a little bit of creative imagination. The Zayin and the Tzaddik are interchangeable, and the Aleph and the Ayin, like Afer and Afar, Zayin and Tzaddik. At a more sort of understandable lesson, we are told that Avram, Vayita Eshel, that Avram planted an Eshel. And Rashi asks, what is an Eshel? And there are a number of interpretations. One is that it's like a hotel, and the other is that it's a shady tree. And as you recall, when the 3 travelers who Avram thought were wanderers or journeymen who worshipped the dirt on their feet, and Avram ran to them and he offered them hospitality, it says he sat them under the tree. So the simple interpretation is, sure, you're out there in the desert, it's very hot, a tree offers shade. So Avram is such a nice guy that he has a shady tree. But then we explain something a little bit more profound, that he planted the tree and he seated the travelers under the tree because Avram is trying to offset the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Tree of knowledge of good and evil is a great opportunity to express godliness. As we know that had Adam and Chava waited until Shabbos, they could have utilized the tree of knowledge of good and evil in a godly manner. It would have been elevated by the profundity of Shabbos. So Avram, in an attempt to sort of offset that, he also had a tree. And his tree is like the offset of the tree of good and evil. And this is another little added characteristic that the Alter Rebbe throws in there, so to speak, sort of like by the way, to add this lesson of, like I'm saying, now that we understand that we have no idea what we're talking about, now we can start talking about it. But there's a certain presumption, and again, I'm saying in a little bit of a silly way, but that is not uncommonly true. That is, there's a sense that everything is based on some premise that we all have decided to agree upon. And once we agree upon it, we can work with it. So we've agreed upon that we can't understand the infinity of Hashem. Okay, agreed. Now we're going to start talking about the infinity of Hashem. So for the remainder of the letter, which is still a pretty lengthy amount of writing, we're really going to start talking about the spheres. So these are ideas that you're already somewhat familiar with or very familiar with. So we'll start to see about them. And remember that when we're talking about the spheres, It's like talking about the tzaddik. This is what we can understand about the tzaddik. This is what we can see about it. And we mentioned this before. The Gemara tells us that we should be very cautious, to the point of prohibited, to make up our own praises for Hashem. And if we want to, we should just use what it already says in Torah. We'll have it coming up that when Moshe Rabbeinu campaigns for the forgiveness of the Jewish people post the story of the golden calf, Moshe draws upon 13 characteristics of Hashem's compassion. You recognize Hashem, Kerachum, Bechanun, Erech, Apayim. You recognize it. And we're told that if we want to appeal to Hashem, we should use the same. Why should we make up our own? Because we're going to wind up saying things that we mean with sincerity, but because of our limited ability, we wind up saying things, and it uses the analogy of the simpleton who comes to the most glamorous palace, and he's so overwhelmed that he's admiring the doorknobs, because that's his ability. That's what he can appreciate. The whole thing is so overwhelming. It winds up being borderline insulting, not intentionally, of course, because we're catching on to something so shallow relative to the true infinity that's out there. So this is that idea, so to speak. Now that we understand that we can't talk about it, we can talk. So here we go.
Rabbi Epstein, I'm so sorry. I'm having trouble with all the analogies. Like, okay, so the tree, when it's burnt, its essence is the ash. However, sorry, that can't be that's the essence. That's what's left. That's the main element. That can't be turned back into the tree. The food analogy, I think you threw me with the food analogy. You got the food analogy with all the ingredients that are mixed together. But if you separate out all the ingredients, they're just different components of the food, which then they're not, are they each an essence of the food? And then if they're combined, they're put back. And then with the chesed part, I know it can't be compared to the chesed, but in some way it's like a simulation of a small, tiny part of Hashem. But what does that have to do with essence and the ash? And why does it say that the chesed is even a greater incompatibility to Hashem's chesed than the ash to the tree, which the ash can't even be made back into a tree or doesn't even resemble a tree?
You got it exactly. Your confusion suggests exactly the point. To nuance it out a tiny bit, in the food analogy, what I meant was, if I see this chemical or this ingredient, and you tell me this originally was, I don't even know, an acorn, I can't even imagine that this was an acorn or wheat or some other chemical. It's been so processed, meaning not just the totality of the food, that it's a combination of multiple ingredients, but that one original ingredient has been so processed and reprocessed time and time again. I mean, an analogy that we're familiar with is the bracha. You take a potato, what's the bracha? Is adama. You turn it into such a powder and so on, that even though it originally was a potato, it's no longer a hadama, because it's completely surrendered any similarity or reflection of that original potato. So it's so completely reconfigured that so to speak, I believe you that it was once a potato, but I can't, when I look at this now, I can't believe this was a potato. Now, when we talk about the chesed, so I do a chesed, and I pass you the salt. Avram did a chesed, and he ran up. They're both chesed, and I guess you could say at some level, my chesed of passing somebody the salt, and Avram's chesed of running to defend the people of Sodom, to offer hospitality to travelers, yes, they all fall in the parameter of chesed, or as we would say, 1 is a number and 100 billion is a number. And 1 to 100 billion, there is a relevance, because if I start counting, Eventually, you'll get up to 100 billion. But our chesed to Hashem's chesed is still not even comparable because it's finite to infinite. So from here to Milwaukee is a journey. From here to the moon is also a journey. They're both journeys, and they're both measurable in miles. And they are conceptually comparable because they both can be measured in miles. But any human behavior and godly behavior can't. So it's exactly the same, except it's totally different. And I'm saying it maybe in a somewhat of a silly way, but that's really the point.
That was good.
The confusion is exactly the point.
Okay.
This makes no sense. Okay, now this makes no sense. Now I'm going to use it. Why? Because it's the best we can do. It's like a parent struggling to understand their child. You don't know what it's like to be 16. Well, I was once 16. Well, when you were 16, life was different, right? They didn't have internet when you were 16, and your child does have internet at 16. Or Moshe Rabbeinu, to use a Chumash example, the Jews who left Mitzrayim were not the same Jews who went into Eretz Yisrael. It was a different generation. But America is nit anderish, but it is different because there's bombs there. Right, its essence is nit anderish, but its form is going to be very, very anderish. So every parent struggles with this. Well, when I was 16, this was my favorite thing. Well, I don't want your, Pong anymore, or whatever it is that you had when you were 16. People still lived in caves. So it's the same, but it's not the same. It's similar, but it's not similar, right? I mean, and again, I know I'm saying it, in a sort of joking way, but I think that is really the point, that we cannot and should not make the mistake of overlapping the two, but they are somewhat similar. Okay.
Thank you for the clarity.
Here we go. Good. I hope it's not clear. Okay. Here we go. Here close to Yud Sfiras, the 10 Sfiras. And again, the 10 Sfiras, if it's helpful, I'll put it back on the screen since maybe it'll be less distracting. Anyway, 10 Sfiras, right? 3 of the intellect. Remember, going right, left, center. So I know it's backwards in the English, but just keep that in mind. We're not talking about Kesser here. Kesser is higher. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, right? This type of thing. Okay, you with me on this? I hope it's clear. Here we go. Shamidas nechlekos b'derech klal is zayin midas. The midas are divided up in the 7 midas, so not the top line. The top line is the intellect. B'chol prati amidas sheba'adam, and every nuance details, like the 7, again, not a coincidence, 7 primary colors. So red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. So how do you have brown? You combine 2 colors. Or how do you have some other color that's not listed there? You combine multiple colors. And those are the primary colors. Like language has primary letters. I don't know anything about music, but I think it's the same for music. Primary musical notes, this type of thing. So all of the nuance character traits, and again, remember the word midah means measurable. That's what the word means. A mile is a midah, a gallon is a midah, an hour is a midah. They're measurables. So that's what these are. But they have a flexibility. And again, just a general introductory point, a surefire sign of holy midah or holy usage of the midas is cooperation. So chesed joins with bina to produce das. Chesed joins with gevura to produce tiferes. Netzach joins with hod to produce yesod, and they all intertwine with each other. Cooperation is a surefire sign of holiness. In unholiness, there's no cooperation. You probably heard that mashal that heaven and Gehenna are the same. In heaven and Gehenna, nobody has elbows. So in heaven, everybody feeds each other. And in Gehenna, everybody just struggles trying to feed themselves. And all these different types of mashalim. The difference between soil and sand is that soil shares its nutrients with the vegetable and sand doesn't share. This type of idea. That's really a little bit separate from this idea, but it's a general idea. Shehain, Sherish called Hamidas, the Chalusan, that this is the source of all of the midas, all of our behaviors, and their intertwining and interconnectivity. Shemidas hachesed lashpia b'ligvul, umidas hagbura letzamtzem lashpia. This is the character of chesed, is limitlessness to give without end. So again, remember the midos are amoral. So if I share my kindness with everybody, I'm a nice guy. If I say, sure, kids, do whatever you want, have as many lollipops as you want, run in the street as much as you want, it's a form of chesed, but it's not kindness in the English term. In fact, even in Torah, we have the word chesed used to refer to a person of no morality because they have chesed, they have no boundaries. Or not to give at all. That is the characteristic of gevura. So gevura means, like the accountant, the engineer, precision, but it also can be just, I'm not doing that, I'm not sharing. Umidas harachamim, this is Tiferes here, called rachamim, is l'rachem al misha shayach lashon rachmanas Allah. The midas mamutzas being gvura lechesed, she lashbiya lechol, gam misha l'shayach lashon rachmanas Allah klal, mesh einu chaser klum, v'enu shari b'tzar klal. Ulfi she midas mumetzas nikras Tiferes, when big day Tiferes, adarach mashal, shebeget savur b'gavanim harbe, muravim, b'derech she Tiferes v'noy. And then what is this thing called harmony or rachmanis? Now the word rachmanis in English, we tend to translate as something like pity or compassion, which I think maybe this is just a very American understanding. It's kind of condescending. That means you talk down to people like they don't know big words. It's kind of nasty to say, oh, I have pity on this guy. It sounds a little harsh. The origin of the word rachamim, just to illustrate this idea, is the word rechem, which is the uterus, where the mother cares for the child. So that's the ultimate compassion, but it's not pity in some sort of, what's the word I'm looking for, like derogatory term. So what is the difference between rachmim and chesed? Chesed means I give to everybody. The sun shines, Hashem created light. Light is chesed. It doesn't just light up what I want and not what you want. It lights up the whole room and the whole world. Rachamim means I do take into account who is deserving and who is not deserving. Meaning rachamim, is not just, well, I let everybody do whatever they want, which is a form of chesed, maybe a distorted form, but a form. Rachamim means I do judiciously distribute compassion. So the judge says, well, that's true. He stole a loaf of bread, 30 days. Well, his children were starving. Okay, I have rachmanis on him. Not like, hey, everybody gets to go home today. That's not rachamim, that's chesed. It could be useful, it could be appropriate, it could be inappropriate. So rachamim means I do consider. And this is why it's called Tiferes. Because Tiferes, I'm translating as harmony, translated as beauty, whatever it is, it's the ability to blend individual aspects together. I mean, the simplest example is, as he says here, a garment that's of multiple colors. So if I'm painting a room, I paint it all one color, nothing clashes, and it's fine, it's functional, but it's not beautiful. Beauty means I take individual disparate aspects and I weave them together into something greater than just their individual parts. And that's why it's called Tiferes or beauty. If you have clothing that's just one color, we can't call that beautiful. It may be nice and everything, but it's not beautiful. Beauty is the ability to blend together individual distinct aspects. Now, when it's manifest in activity, right? So the first line, again, we're not doing the top line, which is the intellect. Chesed, Gevura, Tiferes. Those first lines are sort of the conceptual idea. The next steps, the next tier, Netzach, Hod, and Yesod, when I start bringing them into practice. Now, they're not yet executed until Malchus. But at this level, Netzach, Hod, and Yesod, I'm starting to bring the concept of Chesed and Gevura and Tiferes into its particulars. I'm starting to get real specific. Now again, we probably all run into this, where the giver sometimes gives what they want, right? You ever get a gift from somebody where they give you what they wanted? You know, You don't want it? Or could I have it? Or what they want you to want to have, and so on. Meaning, it's not necessarily that it's mean, but they're not taking into consideration the recipient, or a teacher who teaches what he likes, or you hire a musician to play at your bar mitzvah, and he plays the music that he wants. Or you hire the chef to make dinner, and he makes what he wants. He's not considering the customer, the student, the recipient. So what is a healthy sense? When we start making it particularized to the person. So again, here, tier 1 is the intellect, the origin. Tier 2 is the product. Tier 3 is the result in action. Okay, these tier 3. I hope that's clear. I should have put numbers on it. I'll get this right eventually. Okay, to go in Chachma, for example, he wants to teach a concept, to teach it to his child. If he will teach it the way he understands it, the child's not going to be able to understand it. He's going to overwhelm him. So if he's not teaching, he's just studying himself out loud. He's not contouring the concepts to the student. He has to organize it in a process, and in conceptual idea until he speaks it. So again, taking this back to the infinity of Hashem. So you have the infinity of Hashem. Hashem wants to express himself to this physical world. We'll have it next week in this week's parsha with the Aseret HaDibros. One of the interpretations is, why is there the clamoring, the shofar sounding, and so on? Because when you take the infinite and you compress it into the finite, you're gonna shatter some glasses here. Things are gonna rumble. They don't fit in like a nice, smooth, quiet form. There's going to be a shaking up. One of the interpretations of the 7 days of creation, again, obviously not a coincidence, 7 days of creation, the 7 midos, it's that Hashem really created everything on the first day. And then each day he highlighted, he pulled it out, just as we start to develop our individual characteristics and capacities. You think about this just in a very simplistic form. You go to school, you have the ability to learn language and math and Torah, whatever it is, and it starts to get pulled out, starts to get emphasized. And as many people have probably had the experience, the character of the teacher highlights why those capacities become developed. So does this person have a natural capacity for chemistry, or they just had such a good chemistry teacher and their history teacher wasn't so good? So therefore they love chemistry. They really love chemistry, or they love the experience they had with the chemistry professor. This type of thing. Okay, get the point. Okay. This level where you come up now with the strategy is called Netzach. That's here. That is, it's now ready to be applied. V'hoid, and hoid. Here, hoid, remember, is glory, not my glory. If it's healthy, hoid, it means I'm willing to give someone else the glory. I'm willing to give someone else, ultimately Hashem, the glory. That is, I'm willing to restrain myself to allow Hashem to have the glory. These are considered like, and again, we're not here to study biology, but it's the idea like the kidneys take the understanding of the heart or the conceptualization of the mind, and then, like again, through the story of the reproductive process, to cram the infinite into the measurable and accessible. So it's the kleos yetzes, the kidneys, which come up with the strategy. And again, we're not here to study biology, but we get the idea. And again, this is through the process of reproduction. It is that which came down from the origin, which in this case really is Keser, or at least Chachma. So again, back to our analogy, the parent wants to communicate this crucial idea to his child. If he's going to speak, parents speak, the kid's just going to be overwhelmed and not understand what he's talking about. So the parent has to go through the difficulty and the strain of coming up with a way that they can take the core idea without diluting it and illustrate it and process it down to the child. So the Alter Rebbe is using the model of reproduction to illustrate how the idea comes from the moyach of the father into the impression upon and within the child. But again, the challenge is it can't be so fine like it is in the father's understanding, so nuanced and intense, because the kid's just going to be overwhelmed. In order that the father communicate it in a manner that the child can comprehend it without diluting it so intensely that he's ultimately left with nothing of significance. So this is the challenge. Everybody is at some level a form of a teacher, because you're either teaching your child or you're in a more formal classroom. And the younger the children are, the more skilled the teacher has to be, because it's easier for geniuses to talk to geniuses. It's not so easy to talk to someone who, not that they don't have intellectual capacity, but they have no academic background. It's completely sort of foreign to them. So there's this enormous amount. How do I take this very subtle idea and process it to the point that I can express it in a manner that even a small child can understand, with not overwhelming them, but also not so diluting it that it becomes childish. And again, just an example that we're probably all familiar with, this is one of the great challenges of Torah education, especially in the quote more secular world, where the kid is not immersed in it. They don't see it. So you're trying to teach Hebrew school and you're trying to give it to the kid, but the parents are terrified that the kids are going to like it so much that they'll come home and start telling the parents they have to keep kosher on Shabbos. And the parents like, I sent you to Hebrew school. What are you coming back and telling me all this stuff for? But on the other hand, otherwise they walk away and they just think it's a bunch of silly, trivial nonsense. And then when they, make it out on the escape hatch of bar mitzvah, they say, well, forget it. I'm never going back to this. This is so silly and shallow. All right, we'll stop here.